I'm David Patterson. I'm with the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, here to welcome you to the Mitchell and Miriam Lewis Barnett Lecture, which is part of the Annual Scholars Conference on the Holocaust and the Churches. Welcome to everyone. I'd like to welcome Samantha Ash and our Provost, Inga Musselman, without whom we couldn't do anything. We have the immense blessing at UTD to have a provost and a dean who is phenomenally, both of them are phenomenally supportive of what we're trying to do here. And I can tell you, that's not typical. Those of you in the academic world know it's not so typical. So we're very blessed to have the support. And we're blessed to have the founder of the Ackerman Center, basically, Dr. Zsuzsanna Oshvat, with us. But right now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our Mitchell and Miriam Lewis Barnett speaker, Mr. Glenn Kurtz, filmmaker, performer, author, a man of many, many accomplishments, many talents. He's here to talk about an extraordinary film called 3 Minutes in Poland. There was a showing of this film here in Dallas last week, and it's amazing how deep 3 minutes can go into history. And it just made me wonder, what if the film had been 3 hours? And you go minute by minute, face by face, tale by tale. And one of the most powerful features of the film, as the film brings out, are the faces. Yad Vashem has a hall of names, but this film is a hall of faces. So I urge all of you, those of you, if you haven't seen it, I urge you to see it. Glenn Kurtz is the filmmaker and the writer. You have a book called 3 Minutes in Poland. It's called Discovering a Lost World, in a 1938 family film, a family film. It's been hailed by many reviewers. The Los Angeles Times calls it breathtaking. Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune have given it glowing reviews. The film is based on the book. The film is directed by Bianca Stichter, co-produced by the Academy Award winner Steve McQueen, another Steve McQueen, narrated by Helena Bonham Carter, and the film is quite an accomplishment, and it gives us, it puts a face to this event, a family, a town, names, and it opens up the depth contained in every moment. Please welcome Glenn Kurtz.
Thank you very much, Professor Patterson, Dean Romer, Provost Musselman, the faculty and staff of the Ackerman Center. Oh, how's that? The faculty and staff of the Ackerman Center. It is truly an honor to be here. I'll say an honor, and it is also humbling and a little bit intimidating to be presenting to a room full of such distinguished scholars and to be indeed at a scholars conference. I guess with extraordinary generosity, I might be described as a literary scholar, though I haven't published anything in that field in more than 25 years. I am most certainly not a Holocaust scholar. So what I have to present for you this evening is something more in the way of a report on some spontaneous fieldwork that I undertook, the methodology of which I suppose could best be described as eclectic. It's the story that I never imagined or expected to write. I understand that some of you will have seen the documentary film, which is 3 minutes a lengthening, based upon the book 3 Minutes in Poland, which I published in 2014. Tonight, I will, since some of you will have seen that, I will actually divide my talk into sort of two parts. I'll give a somewhat briefer than usual introduction to the story and to the depth of the research that I undertook to try and understand it. And then I'd like to spend the second half of my talk talking about the sort of implications of the story of the story, the afterlife of the story, which is not anything that's contained in the documentary, and most of it actually has only occurred since the book was published. So it's an updated field report. My story, my part in the story, begins with my grandparents, David and Lisa Kurtz. Both of them were born in Poland in the 1880s, came to the United States as children in the 1890s. They were, like so many immigrant families at that time, they were impoverished when they arrived. It was more difficult, as was fairly typical for the parent generation, to acclimate to conditions here in the New World. And it fell very much to the children to make their way in America. My grandfather left school after the 9th grade to support his family. My grandmother also worked before she was married. And they made themselves Americans. This, I think, was the thing of which they were most proud in their lives. They were not the kinds of grandparents to dwell upon the old country and to tell stories. I should say I never met my grandfather. He died before I was born. And my grandmother, although she lived into her 90s, and I knew her into my 20s, was not the kind of grandma who would gather the grandchildren around her knee to regale them with stories. If you asked her, well, what was it like when you were growing up? She would respond with something like, why would you want to know? So it was a tremendous surprise to me, let me say, that rummaging around in my parents' closet in 2009, I came across a home movie. Our trip to Holland, Belgium, Poland, Switzerland, France, and England, 1938. And here you see my grandmother in the foreground, enjoying a very exciting trip across the ocean, along with their 3 traveling companions. On the far end is Louis Molina, my grandfather's boyhood friend, and his wife Lillian and his sister Esther. Essie, known as Essie. Well, when I discovered this film, everything that I knew about it was in that title sequence. It was a trip, they went to those countries, and it was 1938. But simply seeing the words Poland and 1938 together in a sentence immediately alerted me that this was something of tremendous importance and something I wanted to know more about. Well, if you look at the majority of the film, it is like everybody else's tourist vacation photos. It features them walking in famous places or admiring the sights and mostly waving at the camera. Here they are in Switzerland, here in the south of France, and of course feeding pigeons in Paris. In the middle of this film, however, are 3 minutes documenting their trip to Poland. And I'll play those 3 minutes for you now. And they are extraordinarily distinct from the rest of the film. Instead of my grandparents themselves being the focus of the camera, suddenly they are interested in the people around them, and the people around them, of course, are extraordinarily interested in them. This is not your average tourist video. I'll play it now. Of course, it's a silent film.
Do you know where in Poland this was?
Well, that's what I'm here to tell you about. And you see the commotion created by the arrival of Americans with a movie camera. Well, and one of the most remarkable things is that 2/3 of the film are in color. And that's it. It's just 3 minutes. Well, the moment I saw this, perhaps you've had this feeling too. There's nothing bad that happens in this. It's an absolutely beautiful, if in some senses ordinary, banal picture of a little town. What makes it so powerful and so important, of course, is what we know that the people in the film do not know. And that is how terribly short their lives were going to be after this film was taken. So the moment I saw this, I felt this tremendous sense of responsibility to the people. I was certain that this was likely the only moving imagery of this community, and perhaps the only images at all of many of the people, particularly the children, who appear in it. And so I felt that their memory was now my responsibility. But of course, I knew nothing whatsoever about the film, other than that it was in Poland. Naturally, I wanted to know who I'm looking at. Well, even without knowing anything about it, other than that it's Poland in 1938, it's still an extraordinarily important document. It tells us a great deal about the social relations in a small town. You can see their clothing. You can see how they relate to each other. You can see the groups that form on the street, the way that the houses are arranged. You have an interior scene. You can see something of the decorations. It's an absolute gold mine, in that sense, of period detail. But the thing that one wants to know most of all, of course, is who are we looking at? So naturally, I asked my aunt and my father. They were unanimous that this showed my grandmother's hometown, which was Berezna on the far eastern edge of Poland, actually right on the Ukrainian border at the time. Now it's in the Ukraine. And with some extraordinarily hard detective work and genealogical work, mostly done by my sister, who's the genealogical genius in the family, we found a survivor from Berezna. I traveled to Florida. I showed him the film, and within 1 second he said, "I've never seen this place before in my life." Well, imagine, the family story turned out to be wrong. But that left me at a dead end. If it wasn't my grandmother's hometown, there are a lot of other towns in Poland. I guessed it must be my grandfather's hometown. But despite a great deal of searching, I was not able to find a survivor who was able to help me understand what I was seeing. I did find a survivor, a woman named Susan Weiss, born Chesia Eisenberg, in 1932. So she was 6 years old when my grandparents visited, 7 years old when the war broke out, and 13 years old when the war ended. She was a sole survivor of a family of 9 children. She was found in an orphanage after the war by some distant cousin, sent to the United States. She was adopted by a foster family, and she spent the next 60-odd years trying to forget about her early life. When I met her now in her late 70s, she had begun to try to remember, but it was impossible for her. It was physically impossible for her, not only, I think, mentally, but she could not bring herself to remember it. When we watched the film together, and you could sort of see these impulses clashing in her face, that she wanted to remember and she didn't want to remember. It was an extremely painful and poignant moment. In any case, she could not even identify the town where she was born. Well, with some scholarly background, this threw me then onto archives and libraries. And, well, with my grandfather's, knowing the name of my grandfather's town, thanks to my sister's genealogical research, it's possible to find a fair amount of information when you have the town. I went, for example, to the YIVO Institute in New York and found Landsmannschaften records. These are the Association of Immigrants, typically to the United States, who were now sending money or support back to their relatives in the old country. The perfectly ordinary correspondence. So-and-so wants to send $5 to his uncle, and who has the responsibility for distributing that money, things like that. I could find the business directory, which had the names of all of the tradespeople in the town. I could find a great deal of sort of scattered documentation about the town, but nothing that would help me identify the individuals. One thing, however, I was able to find at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel was this photograph, which was donated anonymously, but it was labeled clearly on the back, Synagogue Doors, Nashelsk, Poland. And there on the right, you see the still from the archive, and on the left, a still from my grandfather's film. You can see in the left panel this up-carved lion, and there you see in the film from my grandfather that carved lion. So it was this photograph that allowed me to document and confirm that the town in the film is my grandfather's hometown, Nashelsk, Poland. I would be remiss, since this is a conference about the Holocaust and the churches, if I did not demonstrate the role that the church played in helping me to further identify precisely where my grandfather was standing when I did ultimately go to visit Nashelsk. It was this one frame in the film that allowed me more or less to triangulate where he had been standing. That's the physical location. Again, with the name, you can learn a great deal of history. So the Jewish population in Nashelsk in 1939 was approximately 3,000 out of a total population of 7,500. But the Jewish community in Nashelsk was dated from the 17th century, and by the mid-18th century, it was sufficiently well-to-do that it erected this very beautiful wooden synagogue, which was considered one of the most beautiful in all of Poland. It stood until the 1880s, when the brick and iron synagogue that you see in my grandfather's film was erected. By the 1930s, Nashelsk was a town on the cusp of modernity. I tend to avoid the use of the term shtetl, because I think for many people it conjures up sort of Fiddler on the Roof, a middle of the 19th century farming village. But Nashelsk at this time, because of its proximity to the capital, it's about 35 kilometers north of the capital, and there was a rail line right outside town, it had a much more sort of cosmopolitan relationship with commerce and with the wider world. So you have, you see the Committee for Aiding Destitute Jews there on the upper left. Some of the tradespeople had trucks, not just horse-drawn carts. There was a famous button factory in the town owned by a Jewish family named Filar. There's a picture of that in the upper right. And there were not one but two amateur theater companies performing, among other things, the Dybbuk. Naturally, you would find all of the political organizations that any town of any size with more than 2 Jews in it would have. And as I say, it was an economically depressed, but a culturally extremely vibrant and active town. All of that ended in September 1939. As you all know, on September 1st, the German army invaded Poland, and once again, because of the town's proximity to the capital and because of the rail junction that was right outside of town, it was something of strategic importance. By September 3rd, elements of the German army were already in town, and by September 4th, it was fully occupied. Immediately, the synagogue was desecrated. The Torah scrolls were burned in the market square. Stores were looted. Women were raped. Men were seized on the street for either harassment, to have their beards cut off with bayonets, or to be seized for forced labor. At the end of October 1939, the territory that included Nashelsk was annexed by the German Reich. It became part of Greater Germany. And Heinrich Himmler at that time issued an order saying that by the end of the year, all of the Jews in the annexed territories should be expelled. The territories should be Judenrein, free of Jews. And so it was barely 3 months after the Germans arrived that the entire population, Jewish population of Nashelsk, was rounded up in the market square. This is on December 3rd, 1939. They were held there for several hours. A contingent was marched to the train station. A larger portion was sent to the synagogue, where there were these beautiful murals on the wall, which they were forced to scrape off with their fingernails. They were held there without food or water overnight. In the morning, they were sent also to the train station, and then they were shunted around various rail lines for about a week. This is December 1939. There are no ghettos in Poland. There are no concentration camps in Poland. I think the German occupiers really had no idea what they wanted to do with this population other than get rid of them. So they were sent originally towards Germany and then rerouted and sent to 2 towns in central Poland, what became the general government, Łuków and Mrzezich. These are towns that at the time had their own Jewish population, and the refugees now from Nashelsk were accepted into the local community and accommodated as best they could be. Eventually, however, both of these towns became primary transit ghettos. That is to say, they became proper ghettos. They would be filled, they would be emptied, they would be filled again. And it was on August 25th, 1942, that the vast majority of the Jews from Nashelsk, along with approximately 10,000 other Jews from other Polish towns, were loaded onto a train car of 100 boxcars. This was under the direction of the infamous Reserve Police Battalion 101. And they were sent to Treblinka, where they were murdered on arrival. By the end of the war, of the 3,000 Jews who had been in Nashelsk when my grandparents visited, fewer than 100 were still alive. And that was in 1945. I found the film in 2009. Even under ordinary circumstances, it would have been an extraordinary thing to be able to find survivors. I searched for 2.5 years, and at that point I thought, well, it's too late. I found the film too late. This is extraordinary, precise, detailed, photographic evidence, and we'll never know what it's evidence of, beyond the most basic information, pre-war Jewish life in Poland, and now in this town. Well, and then I got an email out of the blue from a woman in Detroit who had seen the film online at the Holocaust Museum, where I had donated the original, and they had digitized it. And as the camera pans across the crowd of children, one face leapt out at her. And that's her grandfather. She recognized him as a 13-year-old boy. He's still alive. He's 98 years old now. Here he is at age 13, born Moshek Tuchendler in 1924, middle of 3 sons. And there on the right, now Maurice Chandler, in Florida, holding his first great-grandson. And you can see he looks exactly the same. Well, I spoke to Mr. Chandler that night, literally minutes after he had first seen this film online, and the first thing that he said to me was, "You've given me back my childhood." Well, I think for so many survivors, particularly of soul survivors, I think the trauma, obviously, of the war, and then the secondary trauma of surviving alone, had created this barrier, and everything that had occurred before seemed to him almost sort of unreal or mythological. And yet here he is with his friends, with his family, with his community. Well, from my perspective, if I was going to find one person to be my guide to this film and to the life of Nishalsk, it would be Maury Chandler. He has a photographic memory. He was able to view the film, to remember names, dates, places, to tell stories about people he remembered, to fill in, of course, a lot of information, not only about what was in the film, but about people who were important to his family or important to the community who didn't happen to be in the film. And with his help, it became possible ultimately to tell the kind of story I had dreamed that might be possible, which had the same degree of detail and precision that the film itself captures. I'll play for you very briefly just one small snippet of one of my interviews, one of my many, many, many interviews with Mr. Chandler, just to give you a sense for the texture of his recollection. And we have better pictures of them coming up later, but
yes.
the man with the white beard?
Yeah, the man with the white beard, I think he was sort of the, what they called the ascetic person. His name, everybody knew him by one name. His name was Cheskia. Cheskia is a biblical from the Tanakh. Nobody knew what he lived of. But he was dressed just like that, with that beard, and everybody fed him. He would walk into everybody's house. I remember he used to eat chopped liver with strong onions, and you knew he was coming. You know, black bread, this and that, very simple life. And everybody thought he was, you know, the Jewish version of sainthood.
Yeah. Like a mystic?
Heskia. He would go from different houses, like the Bornsteins, when we used to be there. He would come up and he told stories from the past and so on, and then he'd leave. Nobody knew where he slept, probably in the shul or something. He was that type of a character. Now, the shorter men,
With the black beard.
yeah, his name is Chamnusen Zweighaft, and he was the one, they called him the Matzaiva Kritzer. He was the one that chiseled all the headstones for the cemetery.
Well, you can see that with Mr. Chandler's help, it became a very, very different story. And indeed, with his help and through an enormous amount of additional research, I ultimately encountered 7 survivors from Nishalsk and was able to collect their stories and share with them the information from each of them that I had found. So what I'll do for just the next few minutes is sort of take you on a little bit of the very, very circuitous and strange journey that these pieces of information led to, ultimately sort of connecting back to themselves. So one of the people Mr. Chandler introduced me to was a man named Kiva Richman. Kiva's family had left Poland in August of 1939, literally on one of the last boats to leave before the war began. Kiva was only 3 years old at the time, but because they left under peacetime circumstances, they could bring some of their personal effects with them, including this photo album. Of course, Kiva didn't know any of the people in it, but his mother, in an act of extraordinary foresight, had written identifications on the images. So this was a complete treasure trove of information. But of course, I had no idea at this point who or what was going to be, as they say, important in the context of this story. I'll come back to that question of what's important in a moment. In any case, I had to, in essence, learn and memorize everything that was in this photo album in order to be aware of what came my way, because everything that came my way was a scrap or a fragment or a tiny piece of information that sort of was vaguely half remembered. And in fact, with this page in Kiva's photo album, it became extraordinarily important. Naturally, I went to Israel looking for survivors, and in the post-war period, the American Landsmannschaft had subsidized an apartment block for some of the survivors who ended up in Israel. I went knocking literally door to door, and ultimately found, I believe, the only survivor still living, a man named Mikhail Koprak. Well, he was exiting his apartment on his way to a doctor's appointment when I knocked on his door, and he didn't want to talk to me. But when I learned his name, I remembered a photo in Kiva's photo album, and I quickly pulled up my computer, I pulled up that photograph, and before my eyes, he transformed from a sick and elderly man into like a 6-year-old boy. He was jumping up and down. He was grabbing at my arm. It's his father. And he didn't have a picture of his father. And so this was the first time that Mikhail Koprak had seen a photograph of his father since he had fled from Nashelsk in October 1939. Well, he canceled his doctor's appointment, and we spent the next several hours watching the film and discussing his recollections of Nashelsk. And again, it was completely characteristic of this story that one detail from one survivor would end up either supplementing, often contradicting, or possibly spurring information from another. And this was the case with Mr. Koprak. When we got to that moment in the film where Chaim Nussen, or Hamnussen Zweikampf, the Metziva Kritzer, appears, Mr. Koprak said, yes, him, I remember him. He couldn't recall the name, but when I gave him the name, it opened a memory. And he said, yes, I remember now. Chaim Nussen Zweikampf had his workshop next door to where the school was, the yeshiva. And at the end of the day, of course, there would be all of these little stone chips lying around since he was chiseling all day long, very attractive to the boys who'd been pent up all day, and they would go there and have rock fights. And this would naturally annoy Mr. Zweikampf, who would threaten to get rid of them. And the way that he would do this is he would threaten to give their names to the angel of death. And the boys, of course, figured, well, given his profession, he probably has a good relationship with the angel, and this was a very effective threat. It's a charming anecdote. I want to pause for a moment and think about the unbelievable fragility of that information, the unbelievable fragility of that recollection. Well, not only do we have a name for this image, and now we have this little anecdote which gives us this tiniest insight into the man's personality. How did we achieve it? Because Mr. Chandler's granddaughter happened to see the film online, happened to recognize her grandfather, who happens still to be alive, who happened to remember Chaim Nussen Zweikampf, and I happened to encounter Mr. Koprak and give this name to him. And he had this memory, which would he have ever shared it with anyone else? Who else would care? Who else would think to ask him for it? And yet, because of this concatenation of weightless moments, we have this little bit of information about Chaim Nussen Zweikampf. Well, Chaim Nussen Zweikampf turned out to be a pretty important guy in town. He appears in this, of course, in my grandfather's film, and then also in this other photograph from Kiva's photo album showing the Committee to Aid Needy Jews. I mentioned earlier that I had found the Landsmannschaften documents at YIVO about who had the responsibility for distributing money collected in the US sent to their relatives in Nashelsk. Well, these were the guys. So that documentation had the names of all of the people on the committee, and those are these men. So it was possible to give all of these men their names as well. I'll point out only a few of them tonight. If you can see my cursor here on the upper right, this is Fischl Perlmutter. The photograph was taken in his studio. He was the town photographer. He was also an exceptionally talented artist, and it was Fischl Perlmutter who had painted the murals on the synagogue walls that were scraped off on the night of the deportation. I'll point out as well here Kiva's father, looking pretty tough in the lower row here. And then here on the far left, Chaim Huberman. I mentioned before this question of who's important in a story like this. Well, what does that mean? Everybody was important, but in a story of fragments and a story created by collecting and trying to connect fragments, someone is important if their name appears in documentation in more than one place. And that's the case with Chaim Huberman. In the vast collection at Yad Vashem, there is one piece of paper related to Nashelsk. It's about the size of an index card. It is a record of a meeting held on December 31st, 1939, of the Committee to Aid the Jewish Refugees Deported to Wukov. Well, again, by itself, it's an important document because it shows the community of Nashelsk, this is 3 weeks after the deportation, still trying to function as a community. They are forming this committee. They're trying to create some form of self-help. It's not clear at all to whom they might have sent this note or who they would appeal to. Nevertheless, we have the names of what would be the leading citizens who were stepping up after the deportation to try to hold the community together. Among them, Chaim Huberman. The document itself is a purely bureaucratic protocol. It says we met, we elected a president and a secretary, and these are the names of the members of the committee. And here you can see number 3 from the top in the signatures, Chaim Huberman. Well, what are the other sources of information? It happens, more or less by coincidence, that another Nashelsk survivor, Andrzej Lubaniecki, was present at the discovery of the first cache of documents from the Ringelblum archive. This is the collection of documents created by historian Emanuel Ringelblum and the organization Oneg Shabbat, gathering every piece of documentation that they could from the communities in the Warsaw Ghetto and beyond, and then subsequently burying it in milk cans and tin cans underneath the ghetto. And this was the day of the discovery of the first tin can containing documentation. Well, in that archive of 40,000 documents, there are 4 pages about Nashelsk. 3 of them are the only first-hand account of the deportation, which you heard if you saw the documentary film. That document is read at the center of that film. The 4th piece of paper is a letter. Actually, it's not at all about Nashelsk. It's about conditions in the Lublin district, but it has a PS, and at the bottom it says, "We regret to inform you that our friend, the councilman from Nashelsk, Chaim Huberman, was shot for giving aid to Russian POWs." Of the entire community of Nashelsk, therefore, it is Chaim Huberman who is the only one whose precise date and manner of death I am able to document. Another person Mr. Chandler identified when he watched the film was this young man with the beard, and he remembered the name Kubel. That was all that he remembered. And among the many different sources of information that I consulted were the records of Jewish genealogical societies, which were invaluable. And my sister happens to be the past president of the Bay Area Jewish Genealogical Society, so I had access to 25 years worth of correspondence for the Nashelsk interest group. And there, in 1993, there was an email from a woman seeking the Kubel family from Nashelsk. Well, it was many years later, but nevertheless, I wrote to her, I wrote to that address, and she responded. Faith Olstein responded and sent me this photograph, the Kubel family of Nashelsk. And you can see the same young man with the beard standing in the upper left. Well, Faith and her brother Jerry Goldsmith were the children of the woman here on the right, in the snazzy plaid outfit, Sura Kubel, who was the sole survivor of her family. Sura Kubel emigrated to the United States in 1938. It was a family of 5 sisters and 1 brother. The other gentleman in the center is the husband of the eldest sister, Shandel, sitting in the center. Faith at that point did not even know the names of her aunts and uncles. Again, as is often characteristic of sole survivors, Sura had not talked about her family in Nashelsk to her children in the United States. They knew that she was from Europe, they knew that she had had a family, but they didn't know anything about it. At Sura's death, they found a cache of letters and photographs that she had hidden from her sisters and brother in Nashelsk, including this photograph. Another absolute treasure trove of information. Among those photographs was this one, associated with a letter from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1940. It is the same family, though Sura's children had not even recognized them as being the same people. It's only 2 years later, but this, for me, is one of the most haunting documents I've found. I'm going to place them side by side. The family in 1938 and the family in 1940. It's the same people with the exception of Sura, of course, who's in the United States now. And Shandel, instead of sitting in the center, has moved to the far right of the screen. Look at the difference in her face. This hunted look is, to me, as I said, one of the most moving and haunting images that I discovered entirely in my search. Well, among the many other treasures and extraordinarily interesting documents in the Sura Kubel collection was this photograph, tiny, about the size of a credit card, which they didn't know what to make of, although you can see Avram Kubel, the brother, here, standing in the upper right, standing, in fact, next to Simcha Rothstein, the same man he's standing next to in my grandfather's film. But as I say, I shared everything that I learned from one source with all of the survivors who I encountered. And when I showed this to Mr. Chandler, he was amazed. He was amazed for a lot of different reasons. First, because that's him again, front and center, as he always seems to be. But what was most moving to him, well, first of all, he immediately recognized that this photograph was taken in his family's workshop. They had a ready-to-wear clothing store, and in the back there was a workshop where the tailors would manufacture the clothing. And this was in the workshop. You can see on the wall the men's fashions, spring 1939. But what was most amazing to him was here his presence of his cousin, Elia Appelbaum. Here, Mr. Chandler's older brother, Avram. Here, his younger brother, David. And here on the far right, his father, Shaya Tuchendler. This is the closest thing Mr. Chandler has to a family photograph. The minute he saw it, he said, I know these people. And with his help, and with the help of other survivors, we've been able to document the names of about half of the people. He still tells me that he knows all of them, he can't remember them. And actually, literally about, 3-4 months ago, he dreamed the name of one of them. So it's still an ongoing work in progress to identify all of the men in this photograph. Well, naturally, I became interested in Sura Kubel and in her family. I was able to find her immigration record when she arrived in the United States on November 27th, 1938. And here you see on the top, Sura Kubel. She's 26. He gives her profession as corset maker. Nationality is Hebrew from Poland. Her sister Ruchla is the closest contact in Nashelsk, 10 Rinnik. That just means marketplace. For me, the big surprise was her contact in the United States, Louis Molina, my grandfather's boyhood friend, the person you saw in that first clip of them crossing the ocean. So it was from this that I finally learned just a little bit about what my grandparents had done on their trip to Nashelsk. Sura emigrates only 3 months after their visit. Almost certainly they must have met with the Kubel family and helped to arrange for Sura's emigration. When my grandparents returned, therefore, on Labor Day, September 5th, 1938, well, I think that they had a little tourist video, which maybe they'd show to their family and bore their friends with. I don't think that they thought it was anything of tremendous importance. And yet, of course, it is a memorial to this community. I published my book in 2014 about my research and these interviews with all of the survivors, and I recommend it to all of you. If you're interested in this story, there's a great deal more information than I'm able to tell you tonight or that is in the documentary film. I'll spend now a little while and talk about sort of the reverberations of this story. That's the story, and this is now the story of the story. In 2014, just before the book came out, I realized that this was going to be the 75th anniversary of the deportation from Nashelsk. And of course, I had created some kind of informal community in the course of my research. The survivors, of course, their families, families of survivors who were no longer living, descendants like myself whose families had left before the war. That was maybe 150 people or so. And I said, why don't we go back to Nashelsk and commemorate this anniversary? And it was going to be at the end of October. Who wants to go to Poland at the end of October? I figured maybe 5 or 10 people at most would come. But more than 50 people agreed to come. And here we are standing on the same street where my grandfather filmed the children in 1938. Well, this was the largest assemblage of Jews in Nashelsk since the day of the deportation in 1939. And it was an extraordinary visit. We were very fortunate to have with us one of the survivors, Mr. Leslie Gwodek, here with his wife Celia. He ended up in London, and he came and was able to speak with high school students. As it happens, the Nashelsk Public High School is the building that was originally the David Shmerlach Yeshiva, where Mr. Gwodek and Mr. Chandler and Mr. Koprak had all been students. So Mr. Glodek was able to speak to students who were the same age that he was when he fled Nashelsk, in the same building where he himself had been a student. We were received by the mayor. We had an extraordinary visit. We met, of course, with the priest. And here is this other photograph with Mr. Chandler's oldest daughter, Evelyn, and her husband, Steve, standing with two young Poles, Martina and Adam Dudkiewicz. I'll make a slight digression to explain this photograph. I mentioned Mr. Chandler was the sole survivor in his family. Well, he was in the Warsaw Ghetto with his family, and in May of 1941, he, his older brother Avram, and 3 other boys from Nashelsk escaped. They escaped in the simplest way imaginable. I don't know, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the map of the Warsaw Ghetto. It occupied the center of the town. It was almost impossible for the town to continue to function as a town without public transportation crossing the ghetto. And so there was a tram line that ran through the ghetto. And, of course, no one was allowed on or off in the course of that transit. There were German guards at the entrance and at the exit who would search the tram lines. And yet, it turns out that the Polish guards or the Polish conductors on the steps preventing people from getting on and off could be bribed. And this is what Mr. Chandler and his friends did. It was no big deal to him. He made a couple of extra zloty, and on the other end, the German guard would search the tram and immediately shoot whoever didn't have proper papers. On this day, for this ride, for whatever reason, the German guard simply waved it on. 1 minute they're in the ghetto, literally a minute later, they're out of the ghetto. And it's May 1941. What do? Whether they had information or whether this was purely luck, they wandered out of the ghetto into the eastern sort of farming district, which at that time was one of the only places where Jews were still allowed to live in the countryside, not yet concentrated in ghettos. And they got jobs on farms. Mr. Chandler and his brother on neighboring farms, the other boys nearby. After a few weeks, those other 3 boys decided that this life was not for them, and they went back to the ghetto. They did not survive. During the winter of 41 to 42, there was a typhus epidemic across Poland, and Mr. Chandler's older brother, Avram, died, and he was left alone. He worked on the farm of an unmarried Polish woman named Helena Jagodzinska for almost a year until the spring of 1942. That was when the order came down that all Jews had to be concentrated in ghettos. This is, of course, in preparation for Operation Reinhard, the first mass industrialized killing. The night before the order was in effect, Mr. Chandler was in his room. Helena came to him and said, "What are you going to do?" He says, "Well, I've run out of options. I'm going to have to go to a ghetto." And she said, "No, you're not going to a ghetto." That night, at midnight, her nephew, Stanisław Pacznik, who worked at the County Hall of Records, broke curfew, came to the back door bearing a stolen birth certificate. They taught Mr. Chandler the prayers. They said to him, "Try to be this person." And they sent him away. Of course, he couldn't stay because he was known in that community. And he wandered farther out into the countryside. If you're going to survive with a false identity in occupied Poland, a birth certificate was an important document, but hardly a guarantee of survival, especially not for a Jewish boy, since there was one test you could not pass, no matter how well you'd memorized the information. It's a long, it's a complicated, it's a hair-raising story. I'm not going to go into the details. It's all in the book. I encourage you to look at it there. Suffice it to say, Mr. Chandler survived. He emigrates to the United States. He becomes a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather. 70 years go by, and suddenly he's on the phone with some guy he doesn't know whose grandfather visited Nashelsk in 1938 and made a movie that he's in. So, when we meet in January of 2012, the Holocaust Museum sends a camera crew to document the way that this artifact had suddenly somehow connected these 2 families. They made a short video, put it up on YouTube. It ends up on Polish national television on one of their news magazines one night at the end of 2012. Helena Jagodzinska's daughter, now 80 years old, sees it, recognizes Mr. Chandler, and a few weeks later, I get a message on Facebook from her granddaughter, Helena's great-granddaughter, Martina Dudkiewicz. She writes, "Merry Christmas. We remember Mr. Chandler, and when he left Helena's farm in 1942, he left behind a stack of photographs and we would like to return them to him. So she sent them to me, and I was able to give them back to Mr. Chandler. For their efforts, and now, of course, the Chandlers and the Dudkeviches are close friends. They came to visit in 2019. Helena Jagodzinska and Stanisław Pacznik were named Righteous Among the Nations in 2016, and here is Martina, Helena's daughter, her grandmother, receiving the award from Anna Azari, the Israeli ambassador to Poland, at the Nozyk Synagogue in Warsaw. Another consequence of this trip in 2014, the descendants and I recognized that the local cemetery, the Jewish cemetery, had become a forest. The ground had not been changed, but it had been left to grow wild. All of the headstones were removed during the war by the Germans, very likely to use as bedding for a local airfield that was built in preparation for Operation Barbarossa. We decided as a group that we should try to reclaim the cemetery, which we did over the course of several years, going back every summer for a week or two to cut down trees and weed and carry away tons upon tons of vegetation. This was in association with the Matseva Foundation, an extraordinary organization dedicated to restorative justice led by a Baptist minister, Stephen Rees, who continues to do work in cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries in Poland. In the course of this, we erected a memorial plaque on the site of the cemetery because there was no acknowledgement in the town anywhere that there had ever been a Jewish population for 400 years in this community, and that it had accounted for approximately half of the population for that time. So we dedicated this historical plaque, informational sign, on the grounds of the cemetery. And there's the Mayor Bogdan Ruszkowski, and historian Stanisław Titz, who were present at the dedication. As I say, there was nothing left. The synagogue, which of course had almost dominated the market square, here's a photograph at the top of the synagogue in 1941 during the German occupation. It happens to be the best photograph of the synagogue that I've been able to find. During the war, it was used first of all as a detention center and then subsequently as a stable. At the end of the war, it was derelict and a ruin, and it stood that way for several years. And then at some point, there was an outcry from the local population. Of course, there had been wartime damage in the town. Warsaw, however, having been completely leveled, was the place where any building materials that were available went for rebuilding. So it was very hard to get rebuilding materials in Nashelsk. They said, here's a giant pile of bricks. Why don't we just use that? So they tore down the synagogue and distributed the materials to local community in order to help repair their homes. And I often say that there is no better metaphor for Jewish life in Poland than the fact that in almost every home in Nashelsk there is a piece of the synagogue. And not only bricks. During one of our trips, I was alerted on a confidential tip to go look at a particular house on the outskirts of town, and it seems that one of the gentlemen who had part of the town council who had the responsibility for distributing building materials took a shine to the windows of the synagogue, and he installed them in his home to make this lovely little sunroom. Over the course of several years, we developed a relationship with the woman who lived there now, the man's daughter-in-law, and she agreed ultimately to let us have these windows. Think of it, again, the fragility. What would be the least likely thing of the synagogue to survive? Its windows. And that was what we were able to recover. Those windows now form a part of the memorial that we have dedicated on the grounds of the cemetery. That was built in 2021, of course, because of the pandemic. We were unable to be there. Finally, this past May, 10 years after I first visited Nashelsk, we were able to dedicate this memorial. 10 years of visiting Nashelsk. I mentioned that we had reclaimed the cemetery to some extent. Really, to me, that was, while of course a significant and important task and mission in its own right, was an excuse in some sense to be present in the town, to show that there was still a community that cared about the Jewish history in the town. And as a result, over the course of the years, as we kept coming back, we developed friendships. We had some allies in town. People were curious. They would come to find out what we were doing. And over the course of those 10 years, a profound transformation took place in the culture of the town. Whereas when I had arrived, if any of you have gone back to visit your ancestral homes, you very likely were given, as we say, the stink eye by the local population. You were looked at askance. If you knocked on the door of your family's former home, you were very likely greeted with a measure of hostility, as I was on my first visit. But after 10 years of visiting, a great deal of that had changed. The town during COVID had created a history museum. There are 4 exhibits, and one of those exhibits is of the Jewish community in Nashelsk, using materials that I had shared with them in our 2014 visit. We created a photo exhibit for the local community, and these are now permanently mounted in the town's local history museum, as well as materials that are being returned from people in town. For example, fragments of matzevot, of headstones. What's more, in a local initiative, a local artist has created this extraordinary mural to commemorate the Filar button factory. This was just dedicated, again, this past year, and this is some of the group that visited in May together at this mural. The most extraordinary thing, however, was that a group of local teachers took it upon themselves to apply for a grant to create a K-12 curriculum in Jewish culture and history, which was given in a pilot program of which was given in 2021-22. Students were, again, this is not Holocaust education per se, it's education in Jewish culture. And I think that this is an approach that in many ways can bear more fruit than trying to tell Polish students that they're responsible for the Holocaust, which invariably provokes a resistance. Poles suffered too will be the likely response if you tell them, why don't you remember the Jews? But this, on the contrary, was an approach to understanding their own community. The film itself is the evidence that there was a Jewish community there. And what was that community like? How did they worship? What did they eat? What did they read? How did they dance? There were elementary school students who learned to write their names in Hebrew. There are students here in middle school who are learning about religious objects. High school students were delving further into the history and the culture, including this. I can't tell you how extraordinary it is that in the gymnasium of the Nashelsk High School, the students are learning Israeli dances. Something I never imagined would be possible, and it also is a consequence of my grandfather's 3 minutes of home movie footage. Naturally, as the culmination of this visit in 2020, we were given a presentation by the students as the sort of the culmination of their year of study, including a dramatization of a story by Isaac Bashevis Singer. And we held a screening of the documentary for the community. We actually paid to have a week-long free screening for the community. To anybody who wanted could come and see this footage. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Wow. I'm glad I came tonight. We have a little time for questions for Glenn here. Yeah, Anil.
Yeah, we have more information about Bluetooth, why Maria's grandmother ended up in Bluetooth from Ukraine. So when I saw
There are people in this room who can answer that question far better than I, for why Lukov became the transit ghetto that it did. I am more than happy to find Mr. Berenstein, who's here somewhere, if he'd like to speak about that. No?
Probably availability of transportation lines.
Certainly
Probably.
access to rail lines, why that town in particular and the neighboring town, Mzezic,
Yeah.
impossible to pronounce and even harder to spell. But those were the two towns. There is a great deal of information about Łukov. If you go to the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, you'll find information about that. And online there is also additional information about the original, the small Jewish community that was native to Łukov. I'm not the resource to answer that.
I have another question. You had dialogue at the very end.
Yes.
There is a program on Wednesdays, which is whole dialogue between Jews and Polish people. Is that part of that program?
Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, that was one of the things that I raced over. We've had the great good fortune to work with the organization, the Forum for Dialogue, which is a Polish educational nonprofit, an extraordinary organization. If you don't know of it, go home tonight and look for Forum for Dialogue. This is a 25-year-old organization now dedicated to fostering conversations between, well, Poles and Jews is a shorthand which is very misleading. It's Jews and Poles. Let's see, Poles of Jewish and non-Jewish heritage, because Polish Jews are Polish. So it's a dialogue about Polish-Jewish relations in the Polish context, or non-Jewish and Jewish relations in the Polish context. One of their signature programs is the School of Dialogue, where they send these marvelous, young, energetic instructors into small towns, typically local towns, and they have a semester-long program, seminar, in which the students are asked to research the Jewish history of their own town. And then at the end, to give some kind of a presentation for their community about what they have discovered. And we were very fortunate to have the Forum for Dialogue conduct a School of Dialogue in Nashelsk in preparation for our visit in May 2022. Yeah, and they have a marvelous Zoom series called Zoom In on the Forum, pretty much every Wednesday. Very, very fine information.
Dr. Price.
Another personal
Dr. Price.
question. My wife's maiden name is Huberman. Do you have any more information on Kaya Huberman?
Speak to me afterwards.
He moved to Warsaw when he was a teenager, grew up in Krushevitz.
Aha, okay. I have limited information, but talk to me afterwards.
Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Gloria? Yeah.
Tell us something about your personal and professional background. It's interesting to me that you took such great interest and went to such great lengths to gather all this information.
Thank you. Well, my background is somewhat eclectic. I began as a musician, a classical musician. I ended up getting a PhD in comparative literature and German studies. And I fell into this story through rather circuitous paths. I was actually writing a novel that had the plot where someone finds an old home movie and becomes obsessed with identifying the people in it, based upon a lecture that I heard. And then this made me go remember that my family had some home movies, and I wondered what happened to them, and then the plot of my novel happened to me.
Well,
But I was writing a novel with this plot it was because of the novel that I found my grandparents' film, which is just the first of many absolutely astounding things that took place
you
in
may
the
have
course of
given
this book.
somebody an idea for a novel.
For another
tonight.
novel, that's right. But I will say, it's just an answer to, in essence, why did I do it? As I say, when I first found the film, I felt this profound sense of responsibility to the people who we see in it. There are hundreds of people. And perhaps because some of it's in color, they felt very close. And I had seen this film as a child. I know that my family, we would screen it every now and then. It wasn't a completely unknown thing to me, but it's not something any of us had ever thought about, and certainly nobody had thought about it in a historical context. We'd only thought about it as, Grandma and Grandpa's vacation film. So at first, I felt this just tremendous sense of responsibility. If I didn't try to learn who these people were, no one would. And they would then be erased again
Yeah.
in the same way. So just the fact of their having been preserved by chance in this film was the initial motivation. Well, and then I met Mr. Chandler. And when a survivor says to you, "You've given me back my childhood," it has a very powerful motivating effect. I think there's hundreds of people in this film. Are there other people out there I might be able to return this tiny, tiny fragment of their lives to? So that was why I did it.
Other question? Yes, go ahead. Nancy.
You had a very positive way of putting the friendships there, and it's wonderful that you had a memorial in the cemetery. But in the movie, you also had the cruelties that happened, like the freezing of the people in the synagogue, the Jews, and how cruel other things happened, and that didn't come out tonight. And also, you mentioned there was a mention of the statue to the Pope.
That's right.
Nothing else about the Jews. So
It's true. In the center of the market square where the Jews were collected and from which they were deported, there is now a statue of Pope John Paul II, and not a commemoration of this event. And as I say, when I went there in 2012, there was no commemoration whatsoever. If you went to the town's history website for the history of the town, there would not be a single mention of the fact that for 400 years Jews had lived and constituted perhaps the majority, at least half of the town. So yes, that's changing. Amazingly, there's a younger generation now that feels that there should be more memorialization, that there should be plaques around town to indicate who had lived where, and that the school should recognize the fact that it was originally built as a yeshiva, even though it has a different name now and is the public high school. As for not dwelling on the cruelties that took place, I felt in the course, well, not only tonight because I had very limited time and a great deal of material to cover, but also in the context of the story that I had to tell, it was about recovering the life of the town. I had a film that was before anything bad had happened. It became valuable because of what had happened. But my purpose was not by any means to leap over, but to explain what it was that we were seeing. And that was where I focused my energy. Was to try to restore the life. And I think in general, if Holocaust education so frequently concentrates on the 12 years of Nazi rule, and in the Polish context at least, that leaves out 900 additional years of Jewish life in Poland. And like the education of the Polish students in Nashelsk now, I think that if we concentrate only on its horrific end, we do a disservice again to the people whose lives were so brutally ended. We, in a sense, concentrate solely on what the Nazis wanted them to be, which is victims. Whereas there is this 1,000-year history of Jewish life in Poland, of which Nashelsk's community is a tiny, tiny part.
Other questions? Yeah, great.
Thank you for sharing this beautiful story. So when speak about giving back part of the lives of the people that are in the film, in a sense your family also got part of the history back because it's something that wasn't discussed between the so people think, what's the response of your family in terms of how they feel now about this film that maybe was sort of a memory for everyone and now it's got such great significance?
It's a very strange feeling. I mean, for my immediate family, of course, I think they're simply amazed, as I am every single day, by this very chance event or act of our grandfather that turns out to have this tremendous significance. We still think of it as a family film. And it's a very strange thing that you can watch it on Hulu now, and that it's being shown in Singapore and, all around the world. And there's my grandma and her funny hat. It's a very strange feeling. So I think we all have this kind of divided like we recognize now the historic significance, but often I have to remind myself that it's more than just a family film, right? It has had this impact out in the world in ways that I could never, ever have dreamed of. And that because of the documentary film, which I think is very moving, if I say so, and the credit for that really goes to the director, Bianca Stichter, whose artistic insight and sort of bravery it was to concentrate solely on this footage and not go into talking heads and sort of try and show what the town looks like today or things like that. But really just to dig into these few minutes. I think, you know, it has a life of its own, and people who see it have their own responses that have nothing to do with me, and just it's out in the world and has its own life. And so we have this kind of odd relationship of having to both let it go and let people have their responses and still feeling somewhat possessive. It's our family. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
One story, one small town.
Yeah.
Compared to everything that was vibrant at that time in Poland. Do you have any knowledge of others who have been inspired by your work to undertake this kind of exploration of the attics to find these kinds of documents that will lead to stories of the other stories?
Yes, actually, as a matter of fact, there was recently an article in the Washington Post about someone who donated their family footage, also entirely comparable to this. The family had emigrated, they still had relatives in the old country, they went back to visit and brought a movie camera with them and came home with this footage, which is the only thing that survived. And they contacted me, what should we do with our footage? You know, it's just sitting here. And my answer always is donate it to the Holocaust Museum. Because you never know who might see it or what might come of this. They didn't have a lot of information, and I mean, I don't know of anyone else who has taken their family footage and then spent, well, 14 years of their lives to try and unearth, you know, the details of it. But yes, I'm contacted relatively regularly by people who have materials at home that they don't know what to do with. And my because this is what the history is, and this is what it will be. That is right. We are passing from the moment of remembered history to recorded history, definitively. And these are the records. They should be preserved.
Maybe one more? How many minutes are in 14 years? And how many minutes per minute of the 3 minutes did you spend? Thank you. Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much.